Okay, that was a little too enthusiastic. All right. Yes, good morning to everybody. I want to talk about a cultural miracle that happened. It's really little less than a miracle. Around 700 years ago, around the year 1300, a very small group of people, probably fewer than live in a small-sized city in California, on an island in the middle of the North Atlantic, which is not one of the world's most inviting climates, they made a kind of collective decision to begin to tell their own stories. And what they wanted to do was tell the stories of their ancestors, and some of these people were known to you as Vikings. And they also wanted to tell their own story about how they settled this island and so on. And they started producing stories. Now, they were writing on sheepskin in this cold weather, but they managed to produce more than 100 of these stories, which we now call sagas, some of which are quite long. And if you're not familiar with the saga material, what was the stories of these people like? If you know the Vikings, you might be able to guess some of the aspects of these stories. There are lots of men who run each other with swords in one fell swoop, or people who lop each other's arms off. There's murder, there's revenge, there's betrayal. But what you might not expect is that they had a very intricate system of laws. And so there's lots of legal wrangling, and there are courtroom dramas, actually. There are also stories of honor. They had a very strong code of honor, love, strangely, and friendship. You may be very familiar with the Viking man and the image of the Viking man with his, they did not have horned helmets, by the way. But they did have swords and axes and so on. So you're probably familiar with that image. But you may be a little less familiar with the image of the Viking woman, of which there are many incredible, astonishing women in the sagas. And just to give you one example, there's a woman named Hallgerd who incites her husband to various acts of murder because she gets into fights with her neighbors. And then when the neighbors have finally had enough of them, they surrounded the house and they're accosting the house. Gunnar, her husband, is fending them off with bow and arrow, and it's just like in the Wild West. He's fending off all these people with the bow and arrow, and his string breaks on his bow. And he turns to his wife, who has long blonde hair, of course, and says, can I have a piece of your hair for the bow? And she goes, do you remember that time you slapped me? And she refuses to give him the... So this is just a small example of the women of the Viking sagas. And it may seem a somewhat esoteric subject, but in fact it's really intrinsic to our own culture in a way, and I can give you one important example. In one of the sagas called the Saga of the Volsungs, which you may not have heard of, there's a character named Sigurd. And it says in the saga at one point, wherever the Germanic tongue is understood, people will remember the name of Sigurd. And you think, well, I don't really remember Sigurd. And our tongue is Germanic. English is a Germanic tongue. But Sigurd's other name is Siegfried. And he is a dragon slayer who appears in Wagner's Rings. And he also was transformed and appears in the trilogy by Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. And in fact, he's the hero of The Lord of the Rings as well. And recently, Academy Award was given to The Lord of the Rings. So I guess the people speaking the Germanic tongues do remember the sagas. And I hope that you will join me in a lot of reading and a lot of fun looking at the writings of the people who lived on that island in the middle of the North Atlantic. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda.